I'm Ashley Leach. I'm one of the co-chairs of College Democrats here on campus, and we have a tremendous organization of students here on both of our campuses that are just really enthusiastic about civic engagement and getting involved in politics. We've seen that during the November elections and throughout the year as well. And so we're thrilled to have such a quality panel on campus here. And I would like to introduce Dr. Matt Lindstrom, who is an associate professor of political science here on campus, and he's also the director of the Eugene McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement. So a round of applause for Matt.
All righty. Good evening. Thanks for coming in out of the warm weather out there. So on behalf of the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, as well as the St. John's University Chair in Critical Thinking and the St. Ben's St. John's College Democrats, we are excited to host three distinguished luminaries this evening to reflect on service and commitment to and in public life. We are pleased to host once again Senator Dave Durenberger, St. John's alumnus who was here this past February as he conducted the second annual McCarthy Center residency. This evening can be considered sort of the culminating event of his residency, and we are definitely incredibly indebted to you, Dave, for your amazing week on campus as well as your ongoing commitment to the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Appreciate that. He is joined tonight by Minnesota Public Radio's midday program host, Gary Eichten, tonight's moderator, who's also a St. John's graduate and was recently inducted into the Pavic Museum of Broadcasting's Hall of Fame and is a recipient of numerous broadcasting awards for his work. Real quickly, in 1967, Gary began his work at Minnesota Public Radio as a student at St. John's, where, as you may know, Minnesota Public Radio was founded in Collegeville. And he has now helped develop Minnesota Public Radio into the nation's second largest, but I'd add best, public radio station in the country, public radio organization. And many of you know this already, but I'd like to say, too, that Gary's midday program is definitely the crown jewel of Minnesota Public Radio. And we're very excited to have him host tonight's event, and this may, I believe, this will be rebroadcast, or broadcast, I should say, on midday in the near future. So look for that in the next week or two. Our last panel member, Vice President Walter Mondale, while not a Johnny alumnus, a few slipped to places like McAllister and so forth, but still a good guy. We got some shout outs from McAllister. Yeah, there we go. Some of your fans. Anyway, Vice President Mondale continues to serve the state and the nation with unrelenting commitment to public life. He was a two-term United States Senator, an ambassador to Japan with the Clinton administration, and, of course, the Vice President, as well as the 1984 Democratic nominee to President. He is a subject also, keep a lookout for this, he's a subject of a new documentary called Fritz, which is an inspiring recollection of his contribution to the nation and, most importantly, to this state's place in national politics. Our hope for this evening, then, is to have a conversation that illuminates the past in order to provide some clarity for the future. Our namesake, Senator Eugene McCarthy, once remarked, quote, "This is, I say, the time for all good men," and I'll add women here, "not to go to the aid of their party, but to come to the aid of their country." Now more than ever, we hope to recognize the accomplishments and dedication of this greatest generation of Minnesota politicians and inspire anew lives of public service and commitment to working for the common good amongst the future and current civic leaders here tonight. So while St. John's is without power, I can assure you that we will have a very powerful conversation here tonight, without a doubt. A couple of quick points of business. Number one, in your programs, there is a little bit of a survey, and there are some pencils that you maybe picked up or you could have picked up If you at the end of the event, if you don't mind just kind of filling out the survey, this helps the McCarthy Center plan for future events and improve our programming and marketing and so forth. Second of all, you have an opportunity to ask some questions and offer some comments. There's a comment card in the program as well. Is that correct? Yeah? So, okay. So I was told by the Minnesota Public Radio folks that anytime you have a question, just sort of write it down and raise your hand or something like this, and we'll have student workers pick them up, so you don't have to wait till the end or whatever. Just kind of send them to the aisles, I guess, so it's easier to collect them. So we will be collecting these questions, and they will be read by our host, Mr. Eichten, later on in the program. Also, if you haven't done this already, get that little cell phone thing in your pocket, set it to stun, and we're all set. So, thank you very much for coming tonight. It's a great turnout, especially with the late changes and so forth. I just want to give a quick thanks to the McCarthy Center coordinator, Stacy Pank, who's done an amazing job with all this last-minute organization, as well as the last month or month and a half that she's been in employment, as well as my 4 student workers who are here, phenomenal, and the St. Ben staff for skillfully adjusting to tonight's programming at the last minute. So without further ado, let's thank the folks for showing up. For our guests, great program. Look forward to it.
Well, thanks a lot, Matt, and thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. What a great honor it is, both for Minnesota Public Radio in general, but me particularly, to be here tonight to moderate a discussion with 2 of America's finest public servants, and of course in the name of a 3rd great American. I mean, this is really a big deal, and I'm just pleased as punch to be on the stage. Who would have thunk it back in '67, '68? You know, you're a punk kid, 20 years old, trying to do the work-study thing. Who could have imagined that you'd be sitting on a stage with these gentlemen 40 years later? It's really remarkable. And thanks so much for coming out. Matt did such a fine job of giving us an overview of Vice President Mondale's career, so no need to repeat that. And Senator Durenberger, we know his 16 years in the Senate, Senate Intelligence Committee and Finance Committee, Senator Health, he was the go-to guy in Washington. We should note, Senator Durenberger is still very active nationally on the health care front. He chairs the National Institute of Health Policy, and that's a good thing. What's hard to understand is that Senator Durenberger, who is a proud 1955 St. John's grad, chairs this Institute of Health at St. Thomas. And so perhaps we'll need to ask him about that. Okay, let's...
Well, let's get it out of the way. I promised my father before his death that I would only cheer for the St. Thomas graduate school football team.
All right, well, let's get started. As Matt said, we are recording tonight's program, and if all goes according to plan, we'll have the program on tomorrow at noon, on midday, and you'll also find it on our website, minnesotapublicradio.org. And if for some reason plans fall through and it's not on tomorrow night, it will be on later this week. Gentlemen, again, thanks for being here. If I may start with President Obama. He came, once the election was over, lots of hope, and both you gentlemen supported, we should note, Barack Obama. Lots of hope that things were going to get better in this country, peaking perhaps on Inauguration Day. Well, here we are, 7 weeks, 8 weeks in, and the economy continues to suffer. Problems abound overseas, partisan sniping returning to Washington, D.C. Was all that hope misplaced, Mr. Mondale?
Can I get to the question in just a minute? I want to thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be with David Durenberger. He drove me up here today, and
We're going to have to get you home tonight, right?
you can help in that tonight. And we didn't get arrested. Even I think they're cutting the budget for the highway patrol. But it's an honor to be with someone with such a magnificent record of public service. Gary, as always, I'm thrilled, I'm delighted, pleased to be you. You're the best in this business, and think that both of you, you went to St. John's, you're now a loyal Johnny, and that we're here together tonight. I'm proud to be here. Al Isley, sitting out in the audience, who was my news secretary when I was vice president. Johnny helped develop the McCarthy program, and it's an honor to be with him. And of course, to honor Gene McCarthy, who I was privileged to serve with for many years. I knew him the better part of my public career. I'm glad this center has been established. It's just the right thing, and it feels like the right thing tonight. And I want to say one other thing, and then if you still want to ask your question, I'll listen to it.
If you can still remember it.
Yeah. Well, there was something kind of tough happened to me today. I like vice presidents, except maybe one of them, and a vice president's coming to St. Cloud on Thursday. I'm going to be up here with him, but I said some bad things about this one vice president, and I think it took it personally, and he resorts to suspicious tactics. And today, although I'd agreed to go to St. John's to speak, he turned the lights off on me and the campus.
Muzzled you, Mr. Vice President?
Yeah, muzzled me. Yeah. You want me to start with that? Well, I think that when Obama was elected, the nation was completely excited, thrilled, moved by a profound historic victory and by his leadership. And I think that's still the case. But now he is being tested by some really incredible challenges. And all my lifetime, I've never seen a president confronted by as many fundamental, profound challenges, and all at the same time as is President Obama. And he has to make he has to assault many issues at the same time, any one of which David would have tied Washington up in knots. Washington is a town that's built for inertia. It is the slow walker's dream. And we've got these compelling problems. We've got the slow procedures on the Hill. We've got a government that is virtually unpopulated yet. I think Geithner at Treasury, the only confirmed official in the entire department. And that's true over much of the government. We're just getting started. And so I think there's bound to be frustration. There's bound to be a gap between the excitement and the thrill of electing this remarkable new leader and all that it means on the one hand, and the task of getting down and working the way you have to get big things done in Washington. We have to be mature as Americans. It's not just thrills. These are tough, controversial, deep issues, often challenging the system itself. We have a divided Senate with rules that make it difficult to get anything done without picking up members of the other party. And I think still a divided nation in ways with some nasty disputes that have not been fully resolved, and I think our system reflects that. So I'd say let's have some patience and keep at it and get it done, because America has always faced problems by using these institutions, and sooner or later America's always gotten it done. And I'm optimistic that we'll do it this time, but it's going to be tough, It's going to take time.
Senator Durenberger, do you think all that optimism and hope was misplaced?
No, not at all. And I was probably one who didn't sense that Obama had a chance. Probably a lot of other people were in that boat. But I can still remember the first time that I sort of like got a little choked up listening to him speak. And that actually happened. And I think it was early in January after one of those surprise victories. It may have been Iowa or something like that. And just the way in which he addressed the public, knowing the nation was watching him and listening to him, meant that he was speaking to a whole lot of people who weren't necessarily in Iowa or in New Hampshire, which was the next stop. And it just the way in which he spoke got to me. And then on February 5th, that was the next time. And after that, I started calling older friends, some former senators included, around the country who were Republicans, and I said, what do you think of this guy? And they said, well, you know, it's a funny thing. You know, I listened to him after that primary on February 5, and I got kind of choked up. So, you know, since I'm not a Democrat, and I didn't get involved in Clinton versus whatever it is, I could afford the luxury of just being an American watching an incredible primary on the Democratic side. I mean, even we had a weird one. I mean, John McCain was not supposed to be the Republican. He is about as un-Republican as any of those candidates. So it was a year in which people were speaking in very, very different languages. And so that may be why the rhetoric, in this sense as we characterize it, was so appealing. I have no doubt now but what the person behind the rhetoric is real, that he is the right person for the times, that the only problem we're going to face is the Congress isn't ready. I mean, the rest of our representatives are not ready for this kind of leadership. At the times that we overlapped in our service in the Senate, so I'm not going to try to attribute anything I say to what Fritz might have observed. But there is this appearance from the outside that the Congress and the President are always like this. You know, it's the separation of powers and a bunch of things like that. I found in my service, and I served in the Senate when there were 4 different presidents, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And I found that when the problems got most complex or they got most challenging because of the decisions that had to be made were not necessarily, didn't, poll well with the public, that the Congress became very dependent on the President, very dependent on presidential leadership. The Congress of necessity, particularly the House, has to look 2 years ahead. There's another election, And the Senate has the supposed luxury of looking 6 years ahead. But you don't know how dependent we have become on, in that body on public opinion. And so what the President does in times when we're really challenged is he helps to set a course. He takes the first bullet all the time, before it ever gets to one of us as members of the congressional body. He takes the first bullet. And that's what this President's doing right now. And it's a wonderful time as Americans to watch this process, but it's frustrating when, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, to hear the first reaction to some idea the President has to say, oh, we'll never be able to do that, or the charities will go ballistic, or, we can't do this or we can't do that. Having said that, it's also unusual to have a member of the Senate, not since 1960, I guess, elected President of the United States. This guy knows how they're going to behave. And I think that, in the end, is going to make a big difference for all of us.
So we have a Republican here, a Democrat. How do folks in different parties cooperate with each other, compromise, without selling out the basic principles that you believe in?
Well, it simply goes to why did you go there in the first place? I got there in an era in which The first letter I got congratulating me for being on the Finance Committee, which is the great, powerful Finance Committee on which you also serve. The first letter I got was from Russell Long, who's a lifelong Democrat from Louisiana. And what it did was trace this long relationship since 1803 between Minnesota. You probably got one of those too.
Yeah, same letter.
Between Minnesota and Wisconsin, or Minnesota and Louisiana. And, you know, it occurred to me that I was either getting one of these letters that said, you know, if you butter my bread, I'll butter yours, or the message was, while we have constituents to represent in our electorate, we have the national interest waiting for our decisions. And that was always what happened in the Finance Committee, at least until recently. It was the place in which the national interest on really tough, expensive issues was the way in which we made decisions. So if you focused on that, if you can, everybody brings their belief system, what should the role of government be and all that sort of thing. But if you're focusing on this larger, what am I here for? Or what did I, you know, get my degree over here with a little one-horse, two-horse political science department compared to what it is today? You know, what was I motivated? What was I taught about the role of public service? It wasn't to go and get my way all the time or to have my ideology reflect my vote. So it isn't compromise. I mean, I don't know how many times I worked with the so-called most liberal Senator Teddy Kennedy. But I always knew how far I could take Teddy and how far, you know, just my principles said I could go. And so we didn't always agree, but he'd rather work with me, you know, because I had a defined set of principles in which I believed, and that reflected a constituency that was much broader than Minnesota or myself. And I think there was a time when most people who went there, that was their characteristic. Today, you know, it's harder to see that, and we could talk later about why as a Republican it's become harder, but so it really isn't compromising. It is defining the common interest that you both have, regardless of, you know, how far to the left or the right you may have come from.
Now,
we all have this common interest.
Mr. Mondale, I want to put the same question to you, but in a slightly different context, because you were involved in some really heavy lifting on the civil rights legislation, where it seemed to the outsider anyway that the lines were pretty clear, that there wasn't a lot of room for cooperation, or was there?
No, I think the history says the opposite. We passed the civil rights legislation only because we had a lot of Republicans who supported us. They were called Lincoln Republicans, and they actually believed it. And we had 22 Democrats who voted against all civil rights legislation and would never vote with us on any of it. So we had to, Humphrey used to say, America only gets big things done when the minority cooperates. And when we went after those, every one of them had bipartisan support. Every one of them had to pass with 18 or 20 Republicans, or it wouldn't have passed. And we undid over 200 years of slavery and racism and separately, a really nasty national situation, and we did it because people worked together. So I think that's the history of good things that can happen when people work together. The president did get his stimulation bill. He got it because 3 senators from the Republican Party were listening to the principles that David was talking about and sat down and shaped a bill. It wasn't exactly what Obama wanted, but that's the thing about the Senate. You need 60 votes to get a vote on the measure if they filibuster, which means you have to compromise to get it done. And the history of the Senate has been, that's the place where the nation's differences start getting rounded off, and we learn how to get together, because it's the only way you can get the bill passed. It's a function for which the Senate does not receive a lot of thanks, but I think it's essential. I think we're going to get most or all of these measures passed in one form or another, but it will be changed, but it will get done because there's enough people, and I hope an increasing number of people in the Congress who understand that their principle, if they pursue their political life by just sheer partisanship, with no sense of what the importance of the issue is and how they're going to lose. Because I think the public sees very clearly now that we need a broader sense of public service.
By the way, again, fill out your questions there and send them on up. Love to get your questions included. Gentlemen, I said at the beginning, and I meant it sincerely, that you two are truly two of the finest public servants we have and ever have had. I'm wondering, why is it, and you add Eugene McCarthy to this list, and Hubert Humphrey, Harold Stassen was a great national leader. What the heck is going on here in Minnesota, or what used to go on in Minnesota, that accounts for so many top-flight national leaders coming from a rather inconsequential state in the big scheme of things? Mr. Mondale?
I was going to pass that on to David. We are not an inconsequential state. I'm not sure. I was asked this question at dinner. What was that? I think we had what I called a high tide, a kind of a national consensus in America for a while. And I see some people out in the audience who were with me during those days. And I think the public decided that we had to do something about civil rights. We couldn't continue on that way. A lot of the people that were being discriminated against had served in World War II and risked their lives for the country. How could you then say they had to go home and get behind a barrier and have limited lives? And I think even Southern senators, by and large, although they didn't vote that way, knew that this is something that had to happen. And while we were doing that, we also removed discrimination against women. And look at what's happened in America since that law was passed. All the basic legislation for Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, student assistance, all the environmental legislation. We had a period there when we could get it done. And I think there was a bipartisan belief that that's the things we needed to do. But I think we had a period of hyperactivism, and then the public wanted to slow it down a little bit. We were going too fast. We made some mistakes. And then it's tapered off. And I think we're getting ready for another high tide here.
Senator Durenberger?
Yeah. You know, I think it's, let me phrase it this way, because so many people would tell me while he was still living that, you know, I hardly ever agree with Paul Wellstone, but I'm likely to vote for him because at least I know he knows where he stands. You know, and that's Minnesota. I think that's Minnesota. As we can see with whether you're more conservative or more liberal, whatever the case may be, the payoff with most Minnesotans, or certainly a majority of Minnesotans in both parties, comes with whether or not you're representing their best interests, you know, whether they in particular agree with that or not. And do you do that consistently? Can you always be found standing, you know, in a certain place? And that I think is what is will be over time. You know, when we look back on various of the people that all law, that will be the most distinguishing feature of Minnesota leadership. And that's now the challenge, of course, for us in Minnesota is that population shifts. The population of the nation is shifting to the south. We are disadvantaged for a lot of reasons, like a lot of northern states, and there are people that are taking advantage of that, probably in both of our parties. So that the person who is an independent, you know, the person who is, you know, conservative independent or liberal independent, whatever you may want to call it in traditional terms, is not valued in a current environment, because that's been replaced by some other set of so-called values, often called the base of the party, if you will. And you got to have a checklist now. You know, unless you check off all 5 of these boxes, there's no way you're going to get on the ballot as a, you know, whatever it may be. And that has weakened, in my view, that is what has weakened the really strong tradition of national policy leadership by Minnesota.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, Senator Durenberger, as the resident healthcare expert, and you really are, I mean, all kidding aside, President Obama says he wants to have a health care package put together and passed by the end of the year. Is that possible? After, what, 60 years of presidents talking about such a thing and not a whole lot happening?
Yeah, and to be brief about it, I think a lot of it depends on him, because his ability is to get all of us much more involved than we have been in the past, and that is a key. The second thing is, what do you mean by, legislation passed? I mean, there's no way in God's green earth anybody in the Congress today, I mean, the Congress as an entity or the Congress plus the president, can come up with a piece of legislation by August 1st or December 1st that's going to solve all of our problems. So yes, there will be legislation passed. There will be a clearer identification of the problem than we have today. There will be commitments made, but we are not going to change the system overnight by the passage of one piece of legislation. This is going to happen over his term. And the key will be, does he stay committed to getting the job done, to the goals that he has set up there, like we're going to cut the cost by $2,500 per family, some of those kinds of things. He stays committed to that, and he's going to have a whole lot of people committed to him.
Mr. Mondale, go ahead.
I agree with what David said, but I think there's a different mood in America about health care now. In the past, it always seemed to fall apart. The doctors were fighting with patients. Hospitals had a different position. The pharmaceutical people had something. And it was always a sort of a political meltdown by the time you got there. But I think the public, here we have almost 60 million, mostly working people, if they've got jobs, no health care. We have health costs going through the roof, with a lot of people being pressed in other ways, can barely make ends meet. The story of the day about the sharp drop-off in persons coming to Mayo Clinic. The doctor told me a lot of them tell him they can't afford deductibles anymore. And now you have a lot of doctors for this, a lot of the big companies that find themselves paying these huge bills for health care for their employees and becoming uncompetitive with their competing companies in Asia or in Europe, are saying we've got to do something to take the extreme costs off the back of American companies if we're going to keep jobs and remain competitive. And I think that this will be an American health plan. It won't be the British health plan or the Canadian health plans, which is good for their countries, but I think it will be something that finally unravels that knot and makes it possible for the average American to have decent health care and still carry on a normal life. And that'll be a good day for our country.
Mr. Mondale, having served in both the executive and legislative branches, do you see a shift back to more congressional, Congress playing a bigger role in policy making than the executive? The Bush administration, I think it's fair to say, made a real effort to try to beef up the executive power.
I think that's fair. The constitutional system is one of shared power. Their nightmare was that one branch would dominate the other. And as they said in the Federalist paper, the idea here is to pit ambition against ambition, to have the executive branch pushing, to have the Congress push, and then to have the courts. And so there will always be tension between the executive and the legislative branches, and sometimes the power moves a little bit one way or another way. And I think during the onset of the Iraqi war, power really moved toward the executive branch. And Bush and the others were really pressing that to the point that I was very concerned about it. But I think it's starting to equalize again. You need a strong president. You need presidential leadership. You need them to shape and help suggest the outlines. You need them to shape a budget. It's not necessarily what the Congress will assess, but it starts the game. And of course, you need a very strong Congress that has good leadership, that shapes good legislation, that is responsible and tries to work things out that the nation must have worked out. And so what I'm hoping for is a balance of equally engaged departments that works the way the founders intended. And I think you'll find that that's how it's going to work out, although it's a little early yet, and we'll see.
What do you think, Senator Durenberger? You were saying earlier you thought it's important that it's important to the Congress to have a president to lead and actually to take the first bullet, I think is the way you put it. Do you see the power shift back toward the Congress, or will we remain with a pretty strong executive? President Obama has come out with a pretty sweeping program touching on virtually every element of American life.
Well, let's start with the fact that we've never been through anything like we're going through in our lifetime. There isn't a person in this room that has really lived through, at least as an adult, through the kind of times we're living through now. I mean, we don't know how many people are affected by it. We don't know how seriously they're affected by it. But we know that everybody is in fact affected by this to some degree. America will never be the same again. The economy will never be the same again. Our lives will change. Institutions like this are going to have to change, believe it or not, you know. The healthcare system is going to have to change. Housing policy will have to change. We'll need a national energy policy if we want to have a national security policy. I mean, a whole lot of things have been just sort of like kicking a can down the road for a long period of time until this happened. And so you can't get out of this one by congressional action. That is just not going to happen. But the future will be shaped by the kind of partnership that the President and the Congress are going to develop. And that will be tested through this very difficult period of time. But in the end, since we only have one president at a time, the President is going to really shape the next phase or the evolution of this economy and of this country. And it's at that point that you start digging deeper into the qualities that brought these people to the Senate in the first place and to the leadership and things like that. And when you start getting into, I mean, the health care issue is going to be bipartisan. No matter what some of the ideologues may say, you know, it has to be bipartisan. You get into education reform. You have a president, a Democratic president, who's willing to take on the teachers union and talk about choice in education. Thank God. You know, so that's going to change. And I just think it's going to take us some period of time of stopping to watch, you know, don't stop watching the stock market every day and watching your retirement savings or your whatever it is, depending on, that's my age.
Are there retirement savings, Senator Durenberger?
So, you know, that's why we have not probably seen the best of either institution, the presidency or the Congress, yet. But by the end of this year, I think we will begin to see it much better than we have today.
Great questions from the audience, by the way.
Can I just say one thing? I think that we need a strong president, but you also need a strong Congress with gifted, dedicated people that work on this broad range of complex issues you're going to be involved in. And I think a strong president wants a strong Congress because we need the efforts of both to get it done. A president tends to talk in terms of broad principles, but a congressman comes from a district and is listening to his folks. A senator comes from a state. It has to reshape those national goals a little bit so it fits their state. And it's that process that it really has helped build our country and made us strong. And I think that we need both in the best possible way.
Question from a student for you, Mr. Mondale. As a longtime advocate of international cooperation, what can the current administration do to foster or to restore the image of the United States abroad?
That's a very good question. And I think that it's right at the top of Obama's agenda. For some years, we've been, this is a tough word, but almost contemptuous of international opinion, which is surprising because when our nation was founded, we said we were going to be a new kind of nation with a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. But for a while, it's as though we were it, and we could push the world around. We would have alliances, but they would be of the willing, those who would join us. And I think the self-respect, being treated as equals and partners, is an indispensable element of any effective foreign policy. And it's always been a bipartisan concept, Republicans and Democrats, until this last go-around. And there's damage done in the world. If you look at the Pew polls and so on, at one point something like 85% of opinion was against us. Even in our friendly nations, in democracies, people were getting elected by running against the United States. And so we have to get back or forward to the traditional idea of respectful relationships with as much of the world as possible. When Obama said, "We will shake your hand if your fist isn't clenched," I think that's a good metaphor for how we should. A lot of these countries, I don't say it's going to be easy, but so you say we can't get an Israeli-Palestine peace. That may be true, but I'd like to see America trying to get an Israeli-Palestine peace. You say we can't, oh, you can't get along with the Iranians. They've got this miserable background, they're radicals. Well, let's try and see what we can do. You know, we got along with the Soviet Union, and we at least negotiated with them. We negotiated with China. We've negotiated with a lot of people that don't fit our ideas of what the world should be. And I think in this dangerous world, the United States has to seek new friendships, new relationships, more respect. And I think that the way Obama has begun by sending Dick Holbrooke and these other top people to work on the toughest problems, and many of them are really tough and really dangerous, hold some hope that this new attitude will gain support around the world. We sure better get at it.
Senator Durenberger, how do you see this? I remember President Bush, right before he was leaving office, said that he was asked a question about this, basically the same question. He said, no, America's standing in the world is fine. The only people who are upset with us are a few of the elites and people who are otherwise against us under any circumstance, and that America has never been stronger in the world, never been more respected in the world. What's your take on this?
I'd rather not comment on that because it's I don't know whether you're making it up or if you really said it.
I just report things.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that, you know, when the history of this period is written, it's not all that one-sided. Frankly, I think 9/11 threw them for a loop, and that threw all the cards over in the national security apparatus and the Department of Defense and the unnamed vice president and the unnamed Secretary of Defense and things like that. And the relational side with the foreign relations, the Department of State, a lot of economic relations, a lot of other things that we were making a lot of progress on got lost. And its leaders, starting with Colin Powell and ending with Condoleezza Rice, both of them trying to expand the role, the influence, the better American side of foreign relations, which comes through our embassies, through various liaisons, and so forth. And I think both of them, as secretaries of state, history will write that they tried their professional and personal best against this other establishment, however they're characterized, but I characterize them as the national security establishment, which used the 11th of September of 2001 as an excuse for doing a whole lot of things that they wanted somebody to do a long time before this, and then they got stuck with no oversight by the Republican Congress and no no real check and balance, and then putting down journalism, that sort of thing. I mean, the checks that should have been there through the, we never finished the job in Afghanistan before we went to go after, to clean up the job that George Bush, the 41st, didn't get done, in Iraq sort of stuff. That, I think, has marred a whole lot of other good people, good efforts inside the Bush administration.
Senator Durenberger, here's an audience question for you. What was it that Obama said in that post-primary speech that choked you up?
It was the way it's the way in which he presented. Not just everybody can campaign on Washington has to change and all the rest of that sort of thing. It's the way in which he spoke about we have to change. We, not just Americans or blah, 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 blah. It was all of us. And if you've ever served as the two of us have served in the we chamber, so to speak, where you bring yourself as well as your constituency and so forth, you know that the world we've been living in wasn't going to last at the rate we were spending money we didn't have, and lack of accountability, lack of responsibility, a whole lot of it. This just wasn't going to last. The nothing down forever to pay and then securitized debt, it wasn't going to last, and we knew it. A lot of us knew it. And it was that we, I think, that more than anything else was appealing to me in the way in which he presented his cause for president.
People who are in politics, public servants, are not always respected by the people they're representing. And somebody suggested that I ask you, gentlemen, what is it that you got out of serving a public service? Given all the slings and arrows you suffer, what good in your personally came from serving? Mr. Mondale?
I bet I got the same answer David has. I love public life. Man, oh man, I never left public life willingly. Public helped me out the door. But, you can be in the issues. You can change lives. You can listen to people that otherwise wouldn't be heard. You've got real power in the Senate, at least that's where we were. And the people you meet, the people you work with, the people that become engaged in reform and in improving life and in trying to make a more decent society, it's wonderful to be around people like that. And so I'm really grateful that somehow I got into public life, and I bet you are too, David.
Right, and I'll just use a story to illustrate one part of what you said. It was a time when Jim Jeffords, who was a colleague of mine in the Senate, decided that he was going to switch from being a Republican to being an independent, and that was at a time that threw the whole Senate from the Republicans to the Democrats in, I think, 2002 or something like that. And I just happened to be in Washington the day that took place, and I went to his office, and I asked if I could see Jim, and within 10 seconds I was in to see Jim, and I said, boy, that was quick, how'd that happen? And he said, there isn't another Republican in this country that'll speak to me. So, they'd made him move his desk, the whole schmuck, he was like, boom. So I said, Jim, let me tell you that I could never have done what you did. I've always respected you as being a man of independence. But I read that you were unhappy because the Bush administration, put Judd Gregg on your tail in the committee and wouldn't let you really run the committee and stuff like that. This is inside baseball stuff. Or I read that they weren't supporting some education bill that you favored and so forth. And I'm here to tell you just one thing, because I've now been out at that point for 8 years. And I'm here to tell you that you can do all the education, you can do all the health care, you can pass all the bills you want. That's not what people are going to remember. What everybody will remember is the one relationship that was built between them and you over a member of their family, you know, who was in the military and was injured and couldn't have their injury taken care of, or somebody whose passport you got for them at the last second, or just that. And then not a week goes by, and I'll bet you in both of our lives, but what somebody doesn't come up and introduce themselves and say, I've waited X number of years, you know, to be able to meet you and tell you, thank you for something you did. You brought you connected me with an orphan in Romania, or you helped get us out of Romania. I think this is what you were saying too. That's the one connection you cannot have in any other place in this country.
So about 6 or 7, maybe 10 people in this room who back in the early 60s worked with me as we did those things. We're back together again tonight. It's nice to see you.
So for the young folks in the audience who are interested in making a difference, having an impact, changing the way we do things in this country, is politics the best place to do that? How do they go about having a meaningful impact?
Well, I've told everybody that asked me that question, you start by volunteering to do something in your own community. That's where public service begins. Begin with something you're very comfortable with, somebody you know. And it does not have to be in somebody who's running for office. You can work your way into that. But do the study abroad if that's your inclination, or do the study in the school, the new charter school or the inner city school that you know does need some help. There's so many ways that are available to people to demonstrate to yourself that you have something that a whole lot of other people don't have. And it's that, I think, then that gets to be recognized, and people start saying, hey, would you come and help me with this? Would you help me with that? Would you sign on for this? I need a little help with that. And this is the way these things begin, and eventually somebody will ask you to volunteer to, work on a campaign or something like that.
Mr. Mondale?
Well, I met a lot of the students tonight for St. Ben's and St. John's, and I think they've got the idea. Because I talked to them, they're all thinking about what they're going to do. They're all serious about their studies. Many of them are leaving at the end of this year to go overseas. The person who was at our table was going to India for 8 years. Somebody was going somewhere else, and it looks like you're down the road. And I would say, I love going into politics, but I don't think that's the point that we should leave here tonight with. Politics, I think, a wonderful way to get involved, but there's many, many other ways of serving and helping and having a decent life that doesn't just include yourself, but makes your community and the world a better place. And you're really needed. It's a limitless challenge, but I think they're down the road on it already.
Mr. Mondale, what did you want to be when you were growing up? Besides, you were a hotshot halfback, weren't you?
I was.
You got to explain what a halfback is now.
Yeah. What is it? Yeah. Oh, I grew up in, my dad was a minister. We grew up in small towns. You've all been in them: Elmore, Heron Lake, Salon. And I guess I didn't know what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a football player for a while. Then I went to McAllister, and I went out for the first scrimmage. And I turned around and took up debate. And I got hooked in with Hubert Humphrey, and then with Gene McCarthy, who got elected when I was at McAllister to Congress, and it never stopped. I just stayed in that the rest of my adult career.
Senator Durenberger, the young Senator Durenberger, pre-Senator Durenberger, what did you want to be?
Well, this is true when I was young, and it's now true on reflection. I think I always wanted to be a priest. And I think that was my principal wannabe, that sort of thing. And when I reflect on it now, if hadn't been for all the other wonderful opportunities, I might still say that would be the answer. I had an awful lot of role models here. I mean, I grew up on the campus at St. John, so I had an awful lot of role models, and some of whom are in this room, and others who have obviously passed. But in the political, unlike the the experience that Fritz had, the politics came to me much later and more by association. In my case, it was with Harold Evander when he was governor, and I was his law partner, and he asked me to be his chief of staff. And so it's just like, this is how the things fall in place. And when I was asked to be a statewide candidate, I wanted to be a governor because I never been to the Senate. What's a senator? Didn't even know. So I had other things in mind when I sought that out, but the Lord was working in a different way in my life at the time, and Hubert passed, and Muriel decided she didn't want to run for re-election, and Rudy Boschwitz said, "Hey, Dave, why don't you run for the Senate?" And I said, "You got to be kidding," and ended up 43 points behind Don Fraser, and then Don Fraser never made it through the primary. And the guy that beat him, Bob Short, knew that if he were lucky enough to win that primary, he wasn't going to beat me. Even though I was like, and it turned out the next morning, every one of your old friends came trooping over, to my campaign office and said, "Where do we sign up?" And so how can you can't design that into your life. You can't design that into a plan or anything like that. It's just the way that the Lord decides He's going to use you.
Question a little closer to home here, having to do with the state of Minnesota. As you gentlemen well know, some of the measurements whereby the states are compared indicate Minnesota has slipped a fair amount in the last while. Does that mean that Minnesota has actually slipped, that it's lost its edge, or is this just a statistical anomaly?
I think that we are losing some altitude. I don't think it's a crisis yet, but all the measurements of the quality of our schools, other measurements that judge how well a state is doing, I think we're still a wonderful state, but I think we've allowed the public side to slip. Our schools are not as good as they were. Many of them are not as good as they must be, as has been said by many. Now is a time when our schools have to be better than ever, because the world that young Minnesotans are going to join is much more demanding than ever before. The economy demands it, and so on. And some of this has to be done in our private lives, in our business life, and so on, but some of it also needs to be done together through government to make our educational system work, to make transportation work, to have a handsome and healthy environment, all the things that go into a decent life to make it possible for young Minnesotans to go on to college without bankrupting the parents. There's a lot of things here that we used to do, in my opinion, better than we're doing it now. And I think one of the reasons is that we allowed this idea that government always does things poorly, that if you have a choice to do it in the private sector is always better than to use government. Almost anything government does stumbled. I remember sitting on the platform at the inaugural ceremonies that swore in President Reagan, and he said government is the problem. And I think for a good 20 years or more, Americans increasingly believed that that was the case. And we began to back away from things that we, I think, have to be done if it's going to be done by government. We have to make government work well. But I think it's not an ideological distinction about where government is needed. I think it's a practical distinction. Lincoln once said, government helps us do what must be done, but what we cannot do as well or at all by ourselves. In other words, it's a practical thing. If something needs to be done and it's not being done adequately, and government is the only way that you can get it done, then use government and make certain that it works well. And I think that, if I said this here 15 years ago, a lot of people would say, there's an old socialist talking up there. But I think now we know that part of America's answer has to be the responsible and careful use of government.
Senator Durenberger?
Yeah, I'll add two dimensions to that. One, if you look at the realities, and both of us have watched them over the periods of our lifetimes, the other thing that's seriously slipped in Minnesota is our business leadership and our economic power. Try to find, the major companies in Minnesota who are run by people who are born and raised in Minnesota or even living in Minnesota. They're, the latest is the big red umbrella, which is, started floating out of St. Paul a few years ago and ended up in New York and things like that. But we, both of us, benefited from the involvement of the leadership of this business community in this state, not just in the Twin Cities, but the entire state, in improving the performance of government, in playing a role, in carrying part of the load for a whole lot of things. And that's, look at corporate foundations in Minnesota today. More of them are interested in, whatever it is, the product they make, supporting people who support their product than in the civic. That's part of it. The second one is even more important. It is a role of government. It's the federalism argument. The South's getting by with murder. The South is, takes in twice as much money as the northern states do in proportion to the amount of taxes that get spent in this part of the country. And if you look at, just take the insurance coverage, just take low-income insurance coverage. Minnesota raises taxes on all of us, on all of our doctors, on all of our hospitals, so that we can get as close to fully insured coverage as we possibly can. We tax ourselves. Arizona does not. Texas does not. You can walk right across the southern United States, and you will find 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 30% uninsured in those states. Now, there's an obligation of the national government to provide the resources that we need as a nation so that all Americans, regardless of where they live, have access to health care. But that means some trade-offs at the federal level, and my favorite is always the highway bill. We send 18 cents on the gas tax to Washington, D.C., so Jim Oberstar can decide, where to build highways and things like that. And then if one of our bridges goes down, we don't know whether to hold Jim responsible or to hold Plenty responsible or whatever. So my point being, since I think before Reagan, we always had presidents who worked with governors to try to figure out what is an appropriate relationship between the states and the national government. Since 1982, nobody's bothered sorting that one out. And so that'd be my second response. We are doing a heck of a lot of things here in education and in healthcare and in public assistance and so forth that is not getting done in those parts of the country that are taking our jobs, taking our retirees who decide they're going to live down there for 6 months plus a day and things like that. And that is a inequity that I think calls out the role of government, and particularly the role of a president, to try to help us reverse that one.
How about America have our best days behind the nation? Is this like, for example, the 21st century, the century of China's century? That's commonly heard.
No, I think
theory.
I think America has a great future, but we have a challenged future. There are other countries that are growing and taking the place at the table of the big powers. China, that you mentioned, is one of them. Throughout Asia, nations are gaining economic momentum, but we are still, I believe, the indispensable nation. We are the largest, most prosperous, democratic, educationally advanced, stable, powerful nation in the world. And I spent some time as an ambassador, and I got an idea about how much even other substantial powers still look to the United States to provide leadership, to step up to the plate and help bring others together to shape answers to problems that often no nation can solve by itself. And many of our problems are not just soluble in America alone. So I think we've got a great future, but we've got to be careful to make certain that America provides the kind of responsible, thoughtful, respectful leadership that can make the difference.
Senator Durenberger?
Yeah, whether you put it in the terms of best days are ahead or behind, here's the reality, and this is the dimension Fritz illustrated with Japan as well. We are by far the largest country in the world, particularly one with a representative democracy, that does not have a common gene pool. Just think about that for a while. I mean, the Japanese have one gene pool, and you want to reinvent something in hard times, there's only one way to do it. It's the, whatever happens to be the Japanese way of doing it. We have 1,000 flowers blossoming at all times, and there's more coming into this country all the time from all over this world. I mean, we are a nation of immigrants, and we're a nation of immigrants, and we're a nation of immigrants. We keep being a nation of immigrants. And everybody comes with their ideas, and they come with their hopes and dreams, and they come with their entrepreneurship and their family this, and, they got all kinds of things to offer us as a nation. So we can't run out of gas in this country. It is impossible. And that's why I think even the suggestion that, the best days and all the rest of that sort of thing, that's why I always think the best days are going to be ahead, because that is the nature of this country.
Can I add one thing,
Yes,
just
Mr.
building on David's point? Although we've often stumbled at it, and we've got some black pages in our history book, America has opened its doors to its fellow citizens. And we've ended the gender dispute that used to tear America apart. We don't say we've ended it, but we've made enormous progress on the racial separation that we used to have. We have a president of the United States that represents that. You go down to St. Paul and you see Hmongs and all sorts of people in the legislature, on the school boards. America has, when it's at its best, the ability to rise above racial, ethnic, and religious distinctions and see the common possibilities in humanity that each of us bears. I think that's what our faith talks to us about. But a lot of countries stumble and fall apart because they allow suspicion and hatred about others to tear them apart. That hasn't happened in America, and I think we have a bright future as long as we put that right up front as our most important principle.
Gentlemen, we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to ask each of you, you both served in the Senate, what makes a great senator?
There he is.
Senator, they're pointing at each other for those of you listening on the radio. Senator Durenberger, you want to go first?
It's places like this. I mean, to be frank about it, I mean, each of us is the product of our environment. And that's a combination of the family, it's the community in which you were raised, it's the people that educated you from your, I never had kindergarten in St. John the Baptist. In fact, I went to St. John the Baptist School, which was also Public School 120. I think it was the Cold Spring School District or something like that. So it's really the environment that produces people. I was telling Fritz on the way up that I got there 2 months early and there was no session in the Senate, and so I went around to meet people. And so I went over to say, meet Scoop Jackson, and Scoop Jackson told me about how he represented the same kind of people I did, but they were smarter. I mean, they were they were all Scandinavians of one kind or another, but they kept going. They didn't stop in Minnesota. They just kept going to Washington State. And but he wanted to talk about values and about the values that he learned from the people that he represented. And I think in the end, if you want to see the difference between the weak ones and the strong ones, it's those who carry, a lifetime of experience. I mean, into the Senate. And my buddy Al Simpson used to say, you know, if you don't know what you're doing by the time you get to the Senate, you ain't going to learn it here, you know. So that's probably what I would characterize as a.
Walter Mondale?
Well, I agree with that. I would add one other element to what is required of a good senator, and that is the spirit of compromise. When I got to the Senate, I thought in America, in terms of everything I learned in Minnesota. But after a while, you realize there's other states and other people with other traditions and other histories and other needs, and that you had to listen as well as talk. You had to try to internalize that, try to understand the other person's problems before you could deal effectively with your own problems. And I think the Senate at its best, over 200 and some years, and it's had some worse years, has been the institution above all that sort of held America together, because people had to compromise, they had to bend, even though they didn't want to bend. Except for the Civil War, when it broke down, we took on industrialization. We took on the big changes that have occurred in America, all the changes in the ethnic makeup of America, all the civil rights legislation, all of those things that have happened has occurred in a Senate that sort of tussled and struggled and listened and compromised and checked and moved and so on. And the senators that won't play that game, you need to be strong, but you also need to try to make it work some way by reaching across differences and finding common ground. I think that's the Senate at its best.
Back to the presidency, where we began, and President Obama specifically, the columnist David Brooks said back in January, about the time of the inauguration, that by next January, year into his presidency, Barack Obama will either be a great president or a broken president, talking about all the challenges that he faces. You agree with that assessment? Does he have about a year to do it or not?
I think David Brooks had a bad night before he wrote that. There's a third alternative. He'll have a tough 4 years, but he'll do very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a good way to put it. I agree with him. Mm-hmm.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for a round of applause for two great public servants. Senator Dave Durenberger and Vice President Walter Mondale. Gentlemen, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Thank you. Good job.